the chamber of the Supreme Court grew utterly still. The Chief Justice, here renowned for his reserved expression and firm command of proceedings, slowly removed his glasses and leaned toward the bench, directing a steady gaze at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who stood composed at the lectern. What had started as a routine inquiry into voting rights issues was shifting into a scene that legal scholars would later analyze for years. "Congresswoman Crockett," the Chief Justice began, his voice carrying cleanly across the quiet room. "I must note that it is uncommon to hear arguments presented with such precision under pressure." Spectators traded looks of astonishment. Compliments were exceedingly rare in this setting, and especially from him. Yet what followed prompted even seasoned reporters to scribble furiously. The Chief Justice offered a deliberate nod toward Crockett, a respectful gesture that carried significant weight in the nation's most formal courtroom. In that brief exchange, a first-term representative from Texas achieved something few advocates ever experience: clear, unmistakable recognition from the country's highest judicial authority. Anyone wishing to understand the exact reasoning that prompted this extraordinary acknowledgment and the broader implications of that momentum should stay tuned for a deeper analysis of the events reshaping America's legal institutions. To grasp why this interaction was so striking, it's important to consider the two central figures and the consequential case that placed them opposite each other. The Chief Justice, who has presided over the court since 2005, built a distinguished legal career long before assuming his current role. A Harvard Law graduate, he once clerked for a future Chief Justice, served in a presidential administration, and became one of the country's most accomplished appellate advocates, arguing dozens of cases before the court. Throughout his tenure, he has been recognized for his meticulous approach to constitutional interpretation and his acute awareness of the court's institutional integrity. Observers frequently note his unease with theatrical rhetoric and his preference for narrowly tailored, technically grounded judicial reasoning. Although he was appointed by President George W. Bush, the Chief Justice has at times issued opinions that surprised conservative observers, particularly in landmark cases surrounding national health care reforms. According to constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe, he sees himself as a protector of the Supreme Court's institutional credibility. His approach to judicial proceedings is exceptionally measured, and he rarely reveals strong emotion while seated on the bench. Across the courtroom stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who has represented Texas's 30th congressional district since 2023. Her journey to the House of Representatives, however, was anything but conventional. Before entering public office, she earned recognition as a dedicated civil rights attorney who spent years litigating voting rights disputes throughout the southern United States. Raised in St. Louis by working-class parents, a father employed by the Postal Service and a mother working as a nurse, she grew up witnessing firsthand how restrictive voting policies affected her community. Supported by scholarships at Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, she committed her legal career to challenging voter suppression practices, particularly in communities burdened by generations of disenfranchisement. What makes Crockett especially compelling, observed voting rights scholar Richard Hasen of Oak Irvine, is her blend of technical expertise and personal familiarity with the people impacted by these laws. She doesn't just understand the legal framework, he noted. She understands the lived consequences. The case before the court, a Henderson County Election Commission v. United States, centered on a state statute that eliminated more than 200 polling sites in predominantly minority neighborhoods under the pretext of improving electoral efficiency. Although the law never referenced race on its face, its execution required minority voters to travel, on average, 5 times farther than white voters simply to cast a ballot. Lower courts were divided over whether this constituted a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and a federal appellate panel ultimately concluded that the evidence did not sufficiently establish discriminatory intent. The Supreme Court agreed to review the dispute because of its potential to significantly influence voting rights doctrine across the nation. It raised a broader public question as well: how should we view election laws that, without mentioning race, end up making voting more difficult for certain communities? Many Americans have personal stories of long lines, distant polling places, or administrative barriers, and these experiences highlight why such constitutional issues matter in everyday life. On the morning of the oral arguments, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the courtroom. The gallery was crowded with reporters, constitutional scholars, civil rights organizers, and state officials who had traveled to witness the proceeding. Crockett entered the chamber dressed in a plain navy suit, carrying only a slim binder. While numerous advocates often bring piles of documents, her readiness was reflected in her calm posture and centered focus. The Chief Justice initiated the questioning. "Congresswoman Crockett, your brief contends that the state's polling place allocation formula violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, even though the statute includes no direct racial distinctions. How, then, does one demonstrate discriminatory intent when the text appears neutral on its face?" Crockett responded to this pivotal inquiry with composed certainty. "Mr. Chief Justice, this court's analysis in Arlington Heights lays out the appropriate method for determining intent behind facially neutral measures. We must look closely at the history surrounding the law, the sequence of legislative events, any deviations from typical procedures, and the real-world consequences of the policy," she continued confidently, without referencing her binder. "Here, each of those considerations strongly supports a finding of discriminatory purpose. The state's own analyses completed before the law was implemented projected that the planned closures would burden minority voters at roughly 3 times the rate experienced by other groups." Crockett noted that several alternative proposals, each capable of achieving the same administrative efficiency without producing such dramatic disparities, had been offered and dismissed without any meaningful explanation from state officials. Justice Samuel Alito leaned forward, his tone edged with skepticism. "Congresswoman, a statistical pattern does not automatically establish motive. Isn't it possible that these differences stem from population distribution or other facially neutral conditions rather than race?" Crockett met the concern directly. "Justice Alito, I agree that numbers alone would not demonstrate intent," she said, catching his attention with her straightforward acknowledgment. "That is precisely why we have introduced additional evidence that goes beyond raw data." She retrieved a single page from her binder and held it up. "This internal correspondence from the Secretary of State's office secured during discovery states plainly that the formula would suppress turnout in districts that historically favored Democratic candidates, because voting patterns in this state align closely with racial demographics. As recognized in multiple federal decisions, this document strongly reinforces the inference of discriminatory purpose." Justice Elena Kagan entered the discussion. "Counsel for the state maintains that fiscal limitations justify these closures. What is your response to that argument?" Crockett answered with calm firmness. "Justice Kagan, the record demonstrates that, during the same budget cycle, the state approved $4.2 million to establish additional polling sites in predominantly white rural areas while simultaneously insisting that funding shortfalls required reducing access in minority neighborhoods. That inconsistency undermines the credibility of the state's fiscal rationale." This contradiction, Crockett argued, undermined the state's fiscal explanation and added further support to the conclusion that discriminatory intent played a role. Justice Neil Gorsuch, well known for his commitment to textual interpretation, leaned into his line of questioning. "Congresswoman, the statutory language contains no reference to race whatsoever. Are you urging this court to infer intent from sources outside the text? Wouldn't that approach conflict with textualist principles?" Crockett answered without hesitation. "Justice Gorsuch, textualism does not require the court to ignore surrounding context. In Arlington Heights, this court recognized that a law written in neutral terms can still serve as a mask for discriminatory motives. The wording of the statute is important, but this court has repeatedly held that the Constitution forbids both overt and subtle forms of discrimination." Gorsuch pressed again, his tone sharpened by concern. "But how do we determine where the boundary lies? When does a disparate impact become evidence of intent rather than a coincidence? At what point does the judiciary risk imposing its own preferences over those of the legislature?" Crockett stood firm. "The boundary is guided by the evidence, Justice Gorsuch. In this case, we have contemporaneous statements from decision-makers, rejected alternatives with far less disparate effect, and deviations from typical legislative procedures. These are not matters of judicial preference, they are objective factors this court has long recognized as relevant in assessing discriminatory purpose. Justice Brett Kavanaugh shifted the topic. Let's address remedies. If we were to conclude that the Section 2 violation occurred, what remedy would be appropriate? Would the court not risk crossing into policy-making by dictating how polling locations should be distributed? Not at all, Justice Kavanaugh, Crockett replied. A remedy here would simply require the state to adopt a system for assigning polling places that does not impose unequal burdens on minority voters. The state would retain full control over how to design that system. Courts have enforced similar remedies for decades without assuming policy-making roles. For more than 40 minutes, the exchange continued at a relentless pace. Each justice searched for vulnerabilities in her reasoning. Yet Crockett responded with a steady mix of constitutional analysis, precedent, and detailed factual findings that addressed every angle raised from the bench. Justice Amy Coney Barrett then turned to the broader historical lens. Congresswoman, how much significance should we assign to a state's history of discrimination when reviewing a modern statute that appears neutral on its face? At what point does that historical context become too distant to carry weight? Justice Barrett, Crockett answered, history is most relevant when its effects remain visible in current conditions. When a present-day policy amplifies patterns rooted in that history, the historical context becomes essential to understanding the measure's true impact. In this case, Crockett continued, we have demonstrated that past housing segregation directly shaped current residential patterns, which in turn determines which communities are disproportionately affected by these polling place closures. This is not remote hysteria, it is an ongoing chain of cause and effect. Then came the moment that would later be described as the turning point of the entire argument. Chief Justice Roberts, who had been strikingly active throughout the session, opposed a hypothetical that could unsettle even the most seasoned advocates. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, consider a jurisdiction that uses a race-neutral standard such as one polling site for every 5,000 registered voters. If that rule produces fewer polling locations in minority areas because historical discrimination has depressed registration rates, would that situation trigger heightened scrutiny under your framework? The atmosphere in the chamber tightened. Roberts was renowned for crafting hypotheticals that exposed gaps in legal reasoning. His question required Crockett to reconcile complex constitutional doctrines with real-world consequences. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Mr. Chief Justice, she said deliberately, your hypothetical exemplifies what many scholars call a second-generation bias, measures that rely on predictable social conditions to create racially skewed outcomes while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. She spoke with clear precision. Under Arlington Heights and Brnovich, the proper inquiry is whether officials know or reasonably should have known that their neutral rule would produce substantial racial disparities. If they were informed beforehand that the policy would impose severe burdens on minority voters and still moved forward, especially where less discriminatory alternatives were available, the evidence would support a finding of discriminatory intent warranting heightened scrutiny. Roberts leaned in again. But where do we draw that boundary? Wouldn't merely any election rule be vulnerable to challenge if it results in some level of disparity? This was the moment when Crockett demonstrated her ability to blend legal nuance with grounded practicality. The boundary, Mr. Chief Justice, is set by the Arlington Heights analysis properly applied, she replied. A statistical difference alone is not enough. Some disparities stem from legitimate administrative needs or unforeseeable consequences. The Constitution does not guarantee identical outcomes across all communities. She paused briefly before continuing, her voice gaining strength. But when a state is explicitly alerted that its approach will place severe and avoidable burdens on minority voters, when feasible alternatives exist that would accomplish the same goals with far less inequality, and when those alternatives are dismissed without credible explanation, especially in a jurisdiction with a documented history of discrimination, the Constitution cannot look the other way. The courtroom was silent. Even those justices inclined to oppose her argument were following every word. The 15th Amendment's ban on denying or abridging the vote on account of race was never limited to overt racial labels, she explained. Its framers understood that rights can be weakened through indirect strategies just as effectively as through explicit prohibitions. That is why they chose the broad language "a denied" or "abridged" rather than narrow, formulaic terms. Crockett ended with steady resolve. When sophisticated tactics achieve the same exclusionary effects as the poll taxes and literacy tests of earlier eras, they deserve identical constitutional treatment. Otherwise, we reduce the 15th Amendment to a hollow safeguard, the one that forbids only the most obvious tactics while allowing equally harmful modern equivalents to persist. Justice Clarence Thomas, who rarely intervenes during oral arguments, unexpectedly directed a pointed question toward Crockett. "Congresswoman, many of these districts have had operational polling places for decades. What evidence indicates that their closure under a statewide efficiency plan constitutes intentional discrimination rather than standard administrative judgment?" Crockett faced him squarely. "Justice Thomas, three key pieces of evidence are particularly compelling. First, the state's own pre-implementation data predicted these closures would disproportionately affect minority voters. Second, the Planning Commission's minutes reveal that when this disparate impact was raised, the chair responded, "We cannot be responsible for who chooses to vote." Third, alternative plans capable of achieving the same efficiency with significantly less impact on minority voters were proposed but dismissed without explanation. She added a final point, emphasizing timing. "Perhaps most telling, Justice Thomas, is that these closures occurred immediately after record minority turnout in the previous two election cycles. That sequence provides strong circumstantial evidence of discriminatory intent under this court's precedents." Thomas nodded slightly, his expression unreadable but attentive. Justice Sonia Sotomayor then pressed, "Congresswoman, how should we reconcile a state's legitimate interest in administrative efficiency with the potential burdens imposed on minority voters?" Crockett replied steadily, "Justice Sotomayor, efficiency and equal access are not mutually exclusive. The record shows that alternative Plan C would have achieved 92% of the projected cost savings while reducing the disparate impact by over 70%. When such options exist, a state cannot justify discrimination as the cost of efficiency." As her words hung in the chamber, Chief Justice Roberts sat still, his usual rapid questioning replaced by a rare moment of reflection. The state Solicitor General rose for rebuttal, but it quickly became clear that the momentum had shifted. One justice after another challenged him on points Crockett had highlighted, particularly the ignored alternatives and internal communications about partisan consequences. Justice Sotomayor pressed directly, "If your state knew these closures would disproportionately affect minority voters, and had alternatives that would achieve the same efficiency without that effect, why were those alternatives rejected?" The Solicitor General struggled to respond, repeatedly returning to the statute's facial neutrality. "The law contains no racial classifications," he insisted. "Courts should be cautious about inferring intent from disparate impact alone." Justice Kagan interjected, "But we are not speaking about disparate impact in isolation, are we?" Congresswoman Crockett has presented internal memos acknowledging the racial effect, documentation of rejected alternatives, and procedural irregularities. How does the state respond to that evidence? The Solicitor General, now visibly unsettled, replied, "Those communications were drafts, not the legislature's final reasoning." Justice Barrett pressed further, "Doesn't awareness of likely racial consequences carry legal significance under Arlington Heights?" Shifting his argument, the Solicitor General added, "Even if a Section 2 violation is found, remedies should be limited to affected communities, not the entire state formula." Chief Justice Roberts, unusually direct, interjected, "Counsel, you have not addressed Congresswoman Crockett's evidence that the state was explicitly warned about the disparate impact and chose to proceed without evaluating less discriminatory options. How do you reconcile that with your claim that any impact was unintentional?" The Solicitor General stammered, "Election administration requires difficult trade-offs. The legislature considered many factors beyond what is in this record, including which voters would face increased difficulty. Justice Kavanaugh pressed further. "No, Your Honor," the Solicitor General insisted, "the formula was based solely on administrative efficiency and cost." Yet alternative Plan C, cited by Congresswoman Crockett, would have achieved the same efficiency with far less disparate impact. Justice Gorsuch added, "Then why wasn't that plan adopted if efficiency was the only concern rather than reducing turnout in specific communities?" Flipping through his binder, the Solicitor General admitted, "I do not have those details before me." As the rebuttal faltered, even justices sympathetic to the state began asking increasingly pointed questions. Thomas, attentive throughout, raised what would prove to be the defining challenge. "Counsel, if we accept your argument that only explicit racial classifications trigger constitutional scrutiny, aren't we effectively giving states a roadmap to sidestep the 15th Amendment through facially neutral measures with predictable discriminatory outcomes?" The chamber fell silent. Coming from the court's most conservative member, the question marked a clear shift in momentum. The Solicitor General attempted a careful reply. "This court has always required evidence of intent, not mere disparate impact." "And isn't that precisely what Congresswoman Crockett has provided today?" Thomas countered internal communications acknowledging racial effects, rejected alternatives with less impact, and historical context indicating a persistent pattern. The Solicitor General had no effective response. Crockett rose for her final statement, and the courtroom fell silent once more. "The question before this court," she said, "is whether the Constitution permits states to achieve indirectly what they are barred from doing directly." The evidence demonstrates that this formula was designed and implemented with full awareness that it would severely burden minority voters, that less discriminatory alternatives existed, and yet the state proceeded anyway. She continued with quiet force, "Throughout our history, the right to vote has faced repeated threats from property requirements and poll taxes to literacy tests and now sophisticated administrative barriers. The method has changed, but the effect remains." This case is not about whether states may pursue efficiency in election administration. They may. It is about whether they must do so without predictably imposing disproportionate burdens on minority voters' fundamental rights. She closed with measured conviction. The 15th Amendment was never intended as a mere prohibition on explicit racial barriers. It is a positive guarantee that voting rights must be accessible to all Americans in practice, not merely in theory. "The voters in my district and across the state are asking this court to give full effect to that promise." As she returned to her seat, Chief Justice Roberts set his glasses down with deliberate care. His gaze fixed on Crockett, and he spoke words that would echo through constitutional law discussions for years. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "I must admit, I have rarely witnessed such clarity of thought under the intensity of oral argument. While the court will reserve judgment until our opinion is issued, your presentation today exemplifies constitutional advocacy at its finest." The words hung in the chamber, unusual in a court known for strict decorum and minimal personal commentary. Crockett, momentarily taken aback by this unprecedented acknowledgment, quickly regained her composure. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice," she replied, poised and resolute. "I appreciate your words, but what truly matters is not my performance here. It is whether the court will uphold the fundamental right of every citizen to cast a meaningful vote without discriminatory obstacles." The 1.7 million Americans affected by the polling place closures were not concerned with accolades. They sought the practical protection of their constitutional rights. Crockett's measured response, redirecting attention from personal praise to the broader constitutional stakes, prompted Chief Justice Roberts to nod in quiet respect, a gesture small in motion but monumental in significance within the formal confines of the Supreme Court. Turning to his colleagues, Roberts spoke thoughtfully, "We have heard rigorous arguments from both sides. This case raises profound questions about our commitment to equal voting rights and the court's role in safeguarding those rights." Observers with decades of experience exchanged astonished looks, while reporters scribbled furiously to capture every word. Veterans of civil rights litigation in the gallery blinked back tears, aware that the court had witnessed a rare and remarkable moment. This was more than an argument, it was a recognition that the court's highest purpose lies in translating constitutional principles into protections for everyday Americans. The resonance of this confrontation between Chief Justice Roberts and Congresswoman Crockett extended far beyond the chamber, influencing public understanding of voting rights and legal standards nationwide. Outside, as Crockett descended the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed. "Congresswoman, what does it mean to receive recognition like that from the Chief Justice?" one asked. "This moment," Crockett replied, unwavering, "is not about me or any single justice. It is about ensuring that our Constitution's promises reach every citizen, regardless of race or neighborhood. The real success will come when these principles protect equal voting rights for all Americans." Inside the court, Chief Justice Roberts returned to his chambers, visibly thoughtful. According to an anonymous clerk later interviewed, Roberts sat in silent reflection before saying, "In my years on the bench, I have rarely heard the Constitution's principles articulated with such precision and clarity. Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective to remind us of our deepest commitments." The story dominated legal news and sparked intense scholarly discussion. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe remarked, "In 50 years of teaching constitutional law, I have not seen a courtroom exchange like this." The Chief Justice's response goes beyond protocol. It demonstrates recognition that Congresswoman Crockett captured something essential about our constitutional ideals. 8 weeks later, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Henderson County Election Commission v. United States. In a 6-3 decision with Chief Justice Roberts writing for the majority, the court struck down the state's polling place allocation formula. Roberts wrote that when facially neutral regulations produce severe disparate impacts along racial lines, courts must conduct a thorough review of both direct and circumstantial evidence of discriminatory intent. A law's neutral language cannot shield it from constitutional scrutiny when less discriminatory alternatives exist and were rejected without justification. The opinion directly cited Crockett's argument for moral argument: when sophisticated methods achieve the same discriminatory effects as historical measures like poll taxes or literacy tests, they must meet the same constitutional standard. This principle guides our analysis today, for the voters in Congresswoman Crockett's district and across the affected state. The impact was immediate. The court ordered the state to restore polling places in impacted communities and develop a new allocation system ensuring equal access. In the following election, voter turnout in previously underserved areas increased by 37%, and citizens no longer faced hours-long journeys to cast their ballots. The Henderson County decision quickly became a landmark in voting rights jurisprudence, frequently cited by courts nationwide when examining facially neutral election laws with disproportionate impacts. State legislatures began reviewing and adjusting election policies to prevent similar challenges, reflecting the far-reaching influence of the court's ruling and Crockett's arguments. In the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling, many state legislatures began integrating disparate impact analyses into their election planning, consulting civil rights experts before implementing new policies to avoid unintended burdens on minority voters. For Congresswoman Crockett, the Henderson County decision affirmed her distinctive approach to constitutional advocacy, a method that fused meticulous legal reasoning with a profound awareness of how laws affect real people in their communities. Yale law professor Heather Gerken observed that Crockett's power as an advocate lay in her ability to connect constitutional theory with lived experience. She didn't simply present abstract principles, she demonstrated exactly how legal doctrines translate into either protection or hardship for ordinary citizens. Her arguments made the consequences tangible for the justices and underscored the stakes of constitutional interpretation. Perhaps the most surprising outcome of the case was the unique professional rapport that developed between Chief Justice Roberts and Congresswoman Crockett. Despite their differing judicial philosophies, they found common ground in a shared dedication to constitutional integrity and the pursuit of justice. The following year, they appeared together at Georgetown Law's annual Constitutional Symposium, moderated by Jeffrey Rosen of the National Constitution Center, a rare and highly anticipated joint discussion. "What struck me about Congresswoman Crockett's argument," Roberts explained to the packed auditorium, was not merely its legal precision, but its fidelity to the Constitution's deepest purpose, ensuring that fundamental rights are protected in practice, not just in theory. Good advocacy illuminates the path to justice, even when justices may initially interpret the law differently. Crockett responded thoughtfully. What I valued about the Chief Justice's approach was his willingness to engage sincerely with the evidence, even when it might lead to conclusions differing from his initial views. That intellectual honesty is essential for constitutional interpretation that genuinely serves the people. The Henderson County decision reminded Americans that democratic institutions can function as intended when principled advocates present compelling evidence and judicious decision-makers engage with it in